Welcome everybody to this Alumni online seminar, and it's my great honor and pleasure to have Joyeeta Gupta with us today. We were just remembering with Joyeeta that she was also speaking in one of the first seminars, and I also have the honor to see among the guests our former colleague, Martin Siebel, with whom we have started these first seminars. Thank you very much, Martin, for all what you have done to have this in place, that we have it since many years now. And without further ado, I will briefly introduce Joyeeta Gupta and give the floor to her because we will have a fantastic seminar. Well, Joyeeta Gupta is professor of University of Amsterdam and IHE Delft Institute for Water Education, co-chair and 10-member group advising of United Nations on Science, Technology and Innovation on SDGs. Outgoing co-chair of the Earth Commission, Commissioner, Global Commission on the Ethics of Water, co-chair of UNEP GOCs, and she has also received and is the winner of the Spinoza Prize in 2023. Today, she will have a very interesting talk. I will invite everybody to share, to just silence the microphones and to close the cameras and to write the questions that we are going to ask Joyeeta at the end of her conversation in the chat. Without further ado, Joyeeta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Today I'm going to talk about the need for us to share our Earth. And I will focus a little bit on climate change as a problem area, and then move on at the end to discuss the potential of a global constitution. So what I will do initially is to talk about the fact that we live today in an unhealthy planet, and that has huge impacts on the health of people. And I think that one way to avoid this problem is to adopt just approaches, and I'm going to explain that. When I actually operationalize these just approaches, I will talk in terms of the boundaries and standards, foundations and transformation. Then I'll zero in on climate change as a key driver of other problems, and then end up with how do we govern our planet in a just manner. So let's look at the issue of an unhealthy planet. I was co-chair of GEO6, and that is the photograph of the cover page. And basically, we are talking about a healthy planet and healthy people. But today, 1/4 of all death and morbidity is caused by environmental problems, by air pollution, which kills around 7 million people annually, by water pollution, which could become the #1 cause of death in 2050 because of all the medicines that leave our body and enter into the water bodies. And that leads to, for example, antibiotic resistance. But we also know that loss of biodiversity can lead to a rise in zoonotic disease. And zoonotic disease today is 60% of all infectious disease. And of course, people suffer because the land is getting degraded. So 3.2 billion people suffer from that. And about 1 billion people suffer because the ocean fisheries are under threat. So if you look at all these problems and the growing toxins in the water, air, and food, and how they affect our mental health, this is a really big challenge to take into account. Moreover, environmental problems like climate change or water changes can lead to displacement. And we understand that more people are displaced by environmental issues and water issues than by conflict. And do not forget that even though some of us are so wealthy that we forget how important the environment is for us, the poorest people on earth depend directly on the environment for their lives and their livelihoods. So, who causes the problem? So here on the x-axis, we have privileged people and marginalized. And on the y-axis, we have the contribution to the drivers and pressures that lead to environmental problems. And basically, you will see that it is the privileged people who are the biggest emitters of problems, the biggest users of resources, the biggest meat consumers. And the poorest people actually have the least footprint on the environment. But when you actually look at the different story, who gets hurt? Well, existentially, it is the poorest people who get hurt the most, and the richest people are able to adapt and manage, and they get hurt much less. So, for example, if it gets hotter, a rich person may be able to afford air conditioning. But poor people who live in slums or in poor housing, they're exposed to the full heat of the outside. And so they get much more challenges. And this disbalance between who is causing the problem and who is hurt affects the way policies are made. And so it is important to realize that those who are wealthy and privileged often do not want to take action because they are not seeing themselves as directly vulnerable to the impacts of these environmental problems. And that basically means that they make policies that support themselves. So let us look at justice. Justice scholarship can be local and contextual, or it can be global and universal. It can be conservative, or it can be transformative. Now, when rich policymakers, rich people, rich companies are making policies, they tend to make incremental and conservative policies. And that will reproduce injustice. So we think that it's very important to be more on the right side of this equation in a continuous dialogue between local and global, contextual and universal, and trying to find a plural system of justice. So let me try to explain how we conceptualize this. So the first important element is that we are looking at the right side of the figure I showed you before, and that brings you towards an ideal justice. Second, we are talking about recognition justice and epistemic justice. So if I talk to CEOs of companies, they mostly talk about the profits and their shareholders and maybe labor happiness, but they do not talk about the broader stakeholders. And that is what's really important. Recognition justice is not about putting profits first, it is about putting the last first, the people who are getting hurt by the activities we are undertaking. And epistemic justice is about looking at other ways of knowing, other ways of understanding and appreciating the world, and trying to combine that with the more dominant systems and seeing how do we bring this together in a plural scientific system of justice. The second storyline is we look at interspecies justice, that is the justice between humans and other species, intergenerational, so past and present, present and future, and then intragenerational, that is a justice within generations, within different users and users of, for example, water. And then, of course, there's procedural justice, access to information, decision making, to protest, to go to court, and substantive justice, which is distributive and restorative. So when we conceptualize justice, we operationalize it. Now, my story is about the entire earth. So we are now going to talk about the boundaries of our use of resources from 1 cubic meter to the global system. These boundaries can be quantitative or qualitative, like the quality of water, and they're based on the principle of not causing harm to other species, other people, and other generations. That's the 3I approach. Then we ask the question, can we meet minimum needs within these boundaries? I'll explain this further. In terms of the means, we have 4 major means. How do we address the causes of the problem and inequality? How do we allocate liability for the harm that is caused? How do we allocate the remaining resources equitably? And how do we allocate responsibilities fairly? So, to translate this in a more meaningful manner, let us assume that we have resources depicted in a circle. Then the question is the boundary of that resource that we have identified, is that a just boundary? And then can we meet minimum needs within those boundaries? Do not forget that all minimum needs and human rights have a pressure on the environment. So if you want to meet the minimum needs to water, you'll probably need to look at not just the 100 liters of water you might need per day for drinking water and cooking, but you might want to look at the water you need for your food, the water you need for your energy, the water you need for your small house or your have the allocation of the remaining resources, risks and harm, and responsibilities, all based on the idea of addressing the key drivers of these environmental problems and vulnerability. So, what we have done within the Earth Commission is we have tried to identify what are the safe boundaries to various environmental problems. So, for example, if you take aerosol pollution at the global level, we are looking at the variation between the southern and the northern hemisphere in terms of this pollution because this influences the monsoons. Now, that's very important also from a justice perspective. But aerosols actually kill every day, every year, sorry, around 7 million and more numbers of people. So, this number, the safe number that we have come up with, is not necessarily a just number. If you take climate change, for example, the safe number identified by scientists is 1.5 degrees centigrade. This is because they think that beyond 1.5 degrees, we will trigger all kinds of tipping elements, which will lead to a completely irreversible climate system. But my argument here is that long before we achieve 1.5, we are causing massive harm to people and other species. And so, therefore, this safe number is not just. I'll briefly introduce some of the other safe numbers. So, for example, when we are talking about intact nature, our biodiversity experts say we need to leave between 50 to 60% of nature intact so that uh, other species have space to flourish. But every square kilometer of managed land, so I'm talking about cities and I'm talking about rural areas, they should have between 20 to 25% green. This is important also for the bees and the earthworms over there, but it's also important for our own mental well being. For surface water, we argue that the safe boundary is that the monthly variation in surface water should not be more than 20% in relation to pre industrial times. And for groundwater, our argument has been do not take out more groundwater than you recharge. And then we also have safe boundaries for nitrogen and phosphorus. And currently, we are working on safe boundaries for the oceans as well as for plastics and other novel entities. Now, as I said to you, some of these safe boundaries are not just. So, what we did was we said, let us take WHO standards for per cubic meter PM 2.5 and see how we can adjust the global aerosol boundary. So now we have a new number for the global aerosol boundary. When we come to climate change, our research came up with the proposal that 1 degree centigrade is much more just than 1.5 degrees centigrade, because already at 1 degree centigrade, around 70 million people are exposed to high wet bulb temperatures, which means they can die within a period of 4 or 5 hours. Moreover, this does not include the impacts of extreme weather events, just those happening right now in Pakistan or the forest fires that we are seeing in Greece or Spain or Canada or even the US. So these are other elements that have not been accounted for. But at 1 degree centigrade, we think roughly 1% of the global population is exposed to extreme harm, as well as, of course, other species. And the nitrogen boundary has also been tightened because the impact on eutrophication sets in later than the impact of this pollution on our drinking water supplies. And we are currently seeing whether some of the other boundaries also should be looked at differently from a justice perspective. But you should also remember that justice is not just a number. It must have also a qualitative aspect. So if you're talking about water boundaries, it's a little bit quantitative, but we need to also look at the quality of the water. We need to account for the context, maybe the slope, the climate, the water situation. We need to translate that locally from a global number to a local number. We need to have it spatially mapped across different countries, which we have done, by the way, in our Lancet. We should try and Lancet Planetary Health Earth Commission paper. We should try to link it with poverty analysis to see who is vulnerable and where is these impacts most, and does it affect the most vulnerable. We should try to link it with who causes the problem and who is harmed. We should try to ensure that people debate about it. It's not just what scientists say, it should be legitimate, it should be adopted locally. And of course, most importantly, these boundaries should be achieved in a just manner. Now, where are we today in relation to these boundaries? So what you can see already is that the small Earth represents where we are. We have crossed most of these boundaries globally. And the aerosol boundary, the global aerosol boundary has not been crossed, but the one with the air pollution element has been crossed. So this is a really frightening story. That means we have to now get back into the green space, which is the space in which we are relatively safe. So that was the first element. How do we come up with these boundaries? And of course, how do we match this with quality standards for each of these domains? Now, if you then look at it spatially, we can show you that at least two of these boundaries have been crossed for half the land area, which affects which is where 86% of the population live, and therefore some will be affected because they do not have adaptive capacity or options. But essentially, it exposes everybody that is walking outside on the street. So most of the earth is pretty red or shades of orange, but very few parts of the earth are white where no boundaries have been crossed. So this shows you that this global story can also be explained in a spatial manner. Now let's go to the next question. I've told you that we have boundaries, safe and just boundaries. We're outside the safe and just boundaries, but we have not yet met minimum needs. So the second question is, can we meet minimum needs within the boundaries? So what we did in the first phase is we looked at the minimum needs, especially focusing on human rights, and we calculated them at two levels: dignity and escape from poverty. And then we said, okay, it is in relation to access to water, access to food, access to energy, and access to infrastructure. And remember that energy is needed for all the others, water is needed for all the others. So there's a lot of calculation that has to be done to end up with saying what is meeting these minimum needs. What does that imply for pressure on the environment in relation to the domains I've just discussed and in the same units? So we go beyond Kate Raworth's work, which actually talks about the outer side and the inner side. But in her case, they don't really deal with the same units, but we do that. So this is the impact on the Earth system of meeting just these primary human rights and basic needs. And this is taken for a pre-COVID year, 2018. Now in blue, I show you the current pressure, and be careful to note that it starts at 90%. So 0 to 90% is outside this map, this figure. Then in orange, we show you the additional impact of meeting the basic needs of those people who are below the needs. And in pink, I show you what it would mean if we help them escape from poverty. And basically, for climate change in 2018, this would imply a 26% increase in greenhouse gas emissions, which is a lot. And then maybe you will come back and say there are too many people on Earth, but I can tell you that this additional 26% is equivalent to what the top 1 to 4% has in terms of pressure on the entire system. So there is massive inequality in how we use our Earth's resources. So now I'm going to try and explain the same story in a slightly different manner. On the right side, you see the safe boundary in red. In blue, you see the safe and just Earth system boundary. The yellow ball shows you where we are. Right? Okay, so the question now is, how do we allocate the space below? After a lot of debate, the Earth Commission decided that we were going to give everybody a minimum. So including all of us, everyone just gets 3 bulbs in a refrigerator or the equivalent energy and a minimum amount of food and water, etc. And that is calculated with the dotted blue line. So the safe and just corridor is the space in between the safe and just boundary, and the dotted blue line. And essentially, these are our ends and means. So the ends are minimizing significant harm, the blue line, meeting minimum needs, just foundation, the dotted blue line. And then within the space in between, you have to address the drivers of these problems and translate the targets and translate the whole process. And this basically means that those of us who are outside in that yellow ball, we have to reduce our pressure on the environment significantly. All right. Now, coming to numbers. So we calculated this for 2018 and 2050. And just taking climate as an example, you see that we are outside the system and there's a very small space for us to share after we have given everybody access to basic needs. In 2050, assuming more or less a similar population, assuming population growth, but a more or less similar technological development trajectory, we find there is no corridor. And this also raises very serious questions about what technology should we have, because, for example, AI uses massive amounts of energy and water. And so if AI is going to be promoted, especially the large language models, what does this mean for this entire system? And can we afford a technology like that if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees centigrade? All right, so basically, it's very important that our storyline implies that we need to focus on adopting just targets and trying to implement them, but also just standards, and also meeting minimum needs in accordance with the SDGs. And of course, in terms of the means, we basically are arguing that the economic system has to be changed, the production consumption patterns have to change, the focus on GDP has to change. Technological systems must be adopted based on precautionary principles and affordable systems. We need better management. Maybe we need the stake. It cannot always be incentives. How do we reallocate resources and reallocate responsibilities? And we are now having a mobile exhibition that is moving around Amsterdam to try to explain to people what this story is all about. Let me now zoom into climate change. So on the x-axis, I have time. On the y-axis, I have greenhouse gas emissions. We have to get greenhouse gas emissions to zero ASAP, as soon as possible. And this means that the amount of emissions you can emit as we move towards 2030, 2050 is shrinking. And that means we're all going to fight about who has the right to emit. It was easier to talk about climate change in 1990 than it is today. And as we move towards 2050, it will become more difficult because we are fighting about that small amount of carbon budget. In fact, we are not following this path. We are in overshoot. And as a consequence, there are a lot of impacts taking place in different parts of the world. And there is rising conflict, disagreement, and distrust, and greater demand for justice. And we now have 2 advisory opinions asked at the International Court of Justice and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Latin America, because people are so upset that their human rights are being violated. And of course, technology can solve some of these problems, but technology can also make it worse. And that is because technology uses a lot of energy. So this is something we have to talk about. So this is why we have to talk about justice in climate change, because otherwise we will never solve the problem. And that is the problem today. We are not allocating rights based on justice. And so at the current moment, what we are seeing is that everyone is doing what they want, and it is adding up to a 2.7 degree world, which is really a problem. The other story over here is that when we talk about developing countries and industrialized countries, many developing countries think they would like to become industrialized countries. So they want their GDP to go up. But as you see, developing countries have no more time. If we have to go to 1.5 degrees, which is according to the International Court of Justice, the current legally binding target of the climate regime, the developing countries have to take a shortcut to development. And industrialized countries have to do the same. Now, this is bad news for both industrialized countries and developing countries. Industrialized countries, because they cannot just dump their technologies on the global south, and global south countries should be very careful about accepting industrialized country old technologies. And that industrialized countries don't like. And developing countries don't like this because they all want to become first like a rich country before they can start thinking about change. But there is no time for that if we are trying to prevent a dramatic change to the climate system, which will mean that essentially developing countries will suffer the most, though even rich countries will suffer massively in financial terms. Now, and then there's a political story. And the political story is that we started the negotiation in 1990. And in fact, if we had planned it properly, then we would have had a nice inverted U curve of reducing emissions. Instead, every government has postponed action. And by postponing action, the situation now is that you have to drastically reduce your emissions if you want to get to 1.5. We even think that the next IPCC report will say 1.5 is now out of reach because we've only got 4 or 5 years left to phase out fossil fuel to reach 1.5. And so that basically is the frightening part of the story, that now to implement it radically is in itself also massively unjust. So there are many justice issues involved. And if you just look at the per capita emissions of CO2, you'll see the darker red countries are the ones that have the highest per capita emissions. And if you look at who is suffering, the darker red countries are the ones that are suffering. So it's basically a north-south story, but it's equally a rich-poor story, because even in the poorer countries, the rich people consume a lot, and even in the richer countries, the poor people consume very little. I think it was Oxfam that came out with a report that said that a rich Australian emits as much greenhouse gases in 1 hour on his luxury boat as an average Australian in a whole year. So there is a huge degree of inequality also in rich countries. So let me now go through a series of inequalities and injustices in the climate regime. The first injustice is that even though we knew in 1990 that up to 1 degree it is green, that means more or less we can cope with the impacts of climate change. Between 1 and 2, some parts of the world and some people will suffer a lot, and beyond 2, everybody will suffer. The target was only adopted in 2015, that is a good 25 years later. This allowed rich countries to continue to use their fossil fuel. And this also gave the message to developing countries that they could go on using fossil fuels. This is a very big injustice. The second injustice is because we don't know what the budget is in 1990, we can't allocate it fairly between rich and poor countries. And in 2015, the budget became so small that could not be shared in any equitable manner. And so the narrative changed in the Paris Agreement to voluntary adoption of targets. And as I said earlier, the voluntary adoption of targets adds up to 2.7 degrees centigrade. But this voluntary adoption of targets does not take into account that more than 78% of the remaining fossil fuel is in the global south. So if global south countries would like to use their fossil fuel based on the principle of absolute territorial sovereignty or something like that, then how is it going to be possible for global north countries to convince them not to use that? That's going to be the biggest challenge. So I think that will bring us from a 2.7 degree world to a much higher emission level, and therefore a higher temperature endpoint. The other problem is that if you look at fossil fuels, it's seen as worth between $16 trillion and 300 trillion US dollars, depending on what you count and how you count it. Global GDP is around $110 trillion. So basically, it is the fossil fuel companies and those who use fossil fuel massively who are controlling the narrative, controlling politics, and determining that we should not take action. And this often ends up through misinformation and disinformation. I'll come back to that later. The fourth injustice is that in this entire 30-year period, 35-year period up till now, the focus has been on efficient mechanisms, so that's market mechanisms. But most of these market mechanisms were neither equitable nor effective, and there was very little emphasis put on teaching the public about climate change, teaching people above the age of 35 what climate change is, so that they understand that it's a really serious problem. And then, of course, adaptation. The climate impacts are valued today at between $15 million per hour. And I heard from the European Union that this is an underestimate, that we should go for a higher number. Who's going to pay for it? Is it going to be the poor people who will pay for it with their lives and with their loss of livelihoods and food losses through migration? Who's paying for this? So this is going to be a huge, huge problem. And finally, in the climate negotiations, we talk about energy efficiency and a little bit about fossil fuel. We hardly spoke about fossil fuel all these years, but we never speak about the fact that it is perhaps the way we define development that is the problem, and that the instruments that we're adopting are promoting inequality, injustice, and lack of resilience. So, in my view, the injustice issues have multiplied since 1990. Just to explain one little story about stranded assets and stranded resources. A stranded resource is the resource that is under the ground that you have not yet used, and that is mostly available in developing countries. A stranded asset is an asset that you've already opened and you've spent a lot of money to take out that asset, but now you have to close it down, and therefore there's a problem with re-employing the labor, closing down the factory, restoring the land back to its pristine state. So this map shows you the coal mines and its lifetime. The little round circles are the different coal mines, and if they are white in color, they show you that they have a very short lifetime ahead. But if you look at South Asia, you'll find that many of these coal mines are dark red in color, and that means they have a long lifetime. Basically, what rich countries have done is that they delayed their action till 2015, because then you get the legally binding temperature target. And after that, if they take measures, they ensure that by the time they take measures, the coal mines will close down automatically. Whereas for developing countries, this is going to be an extremely expensive process. My colleague Yang Chen has calculated that for China and India, it might cost them a year's GDP if they have to close down their coal mines. So this is a really big challenge. And the question is, how do we deal with these kinds of challenges? Let me give you one example of a market mechanism. So normally when we talk about emissions trading, you need to know how big the carbon budget is. Then you need to divide that between countries, and then you say that countries can trade, and this is an efficient solution. But till 2015, we did not have a long-term target, so it was very difficult to actually allocate this between countries. Now, you could allocate them per capita, so that means every individual gets a certain amount of emission rights. But this was not politically possible because rich countries opposed this idea for a long time, especially in the 1990s. And it could be done through grandfathering, and some of the developing countries opposed this because they thought that they would lose. Now, what is the difference between per capita and grandfathering? So if you take a carbon budget and a per capita approach, the global south gets a larger amount of the carbon budget and the global north a smaller amount. So the north has to buy the right to pollute from the south, which makes it possible for a north-south transfer of resources. But this was not agreed to in the early 1990s. Grandfathering means that who is actually polluting? So if the north is polluting more and the south is polluting less, that means now the south has to pay the north the right to pollute. And this would mean that the south would get poorer and poorer if this grandfathering principle was adopted. Now, eventually, in the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, we get a mixture where the North has to reduce its emissions by 5.2%, but they can do that by investing in the South, and the South can keep increasing its emissions. Now, in theory, this means that the North can also keep increasing its emissions, but it is investing in projects in the global South, and it takes credits over to its side of the balance sheet. So this is a problem in the way the market mechanism was designed. And of course, that is the reason why NGOs said that this currency note is a repetition of colonialism, because the history of colonialism goes in parallel with the creation of new commodities and slavery and coffee, oil, and now carbon. So the biggest problem today is that most people do not have a good understanding of climate change. So they're sitting at the table down there and they have really not much of an idea of what's happening. Very few of them have really understood what is overshoot, what is a tipping point, what is 1.5 degrees, what does it mean for my country. They haven't figured it out. And then they basically see a big blur and then they think, oh gosh, what can I do? And I have no power. And I'm constantly meeting people who are saying they have no power to deal with the problem. Now, in the meanwhile, even though we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is assessing the science, so they read all the climate science, or at least are supposed to read all the climate science, and summarize it and make it available to the negotiators so they understand what is the current state of knowledge. Even though we have this massive amount of knowledge, something else is happening in the background. It's denial and delay. And the oil and gas companies, and we have records of that and information about it, especially with respect to those from the North America and also from Europe. Since 1950, they knew about it because don't forget climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, that knowledge about that goes back to 1856. The first thing they said, oh, it's hardly noticeable. There's no real climate change. Then they started to question the science and say, you've got it wrong. The models are not representative of real life. The scientists are paid by government or they're paid by somebody else. Therefore, they are not completely neutral actors. And then, of course, I, as a scientist, don't have a lobby budget, but of course, oil companies and gas companies have lobby budgets. So we can just do a simple press release and give it to the companies and the policymakers. But these lobbying companies, they lobby heavily at Parliament, with all these government officials, and that's how they try to change the way policies are made. And then you have the revolving door where senior officials in the oil companies join the EU or the US government, and senior US government and EU officials join the oil companies. I'm sure this also happens in many developing countries as well. But some people have done research and come out with a number of cases of revolving door. Once denial became really difficult to keep pushing, then the topic became delay. And so what you'll find is in the documentation of the oil and gas companies and even the coal companies is it's necessary to have oil and gas. It's inevitable. People need it. We have to continue. Renewable energy can never grow so fast. The other thing they do is greenwashing. They give you part of the truth. They say, oh yeah, we're investing in renewables, but it's less than 1% of their capex. So it's really tiny. And then they're telling you half truths about what they're doing. And of course, they'll tell you, don't worry, technology will solve the problem. You know, we will do carbon capture and storage, which is extremely expensive. You have to catch the carbon, put it underneath the sea or whatever. It's very expensive. Or put a mirror in space or pump the oceans full of algae so that they eat up the CO2. And increasingly, they're trying to change who is to be blamed. So they say, well, the problem is it's the customer. The customer wants to drive a car. The customer wants to fly a plane. The customer wants goods and services coming in boats. So it's not us. We are just meeting the needs of the customer. So we are not responsible. So these narratives, first they prepare them, then they market it through social media, through advertisements, through lobbying activities, and then they control this whole space of misinformation and disinformation. And that makes it very difficult when you're talking to the public to understand what these people are influenced by. A lot of them are influenced by this. And because the government has not used the persuasive mechanisms to educate the public, this has been a really big problem. I am seeing four major tragedies today, and I think there are four major opportunities. The first is that small governments, small companies, and small households, they are saying my emissions don't matter. And like in the Netherlands would say that SMEs, small and medium-sized companies, are saying that. Our interviews with households are saying that people say we are so tiny, how can we make a difference? But actually, the bottom line is every single emission matters, and you need to take action. And in fact, the court in the Netherlands, in the Urkenda case, did say to the Netherlands government that it doesn't matter what other countries are doing, the Netherlands must take action in accordance with its emissions and the latest knowledge. Then there are very large countries then there are groups that say, I'm spending my money well, but they ignore their income sources. And I'm going to give you two examples. One is philanthropy, and the other one is the city of Amsterdam. So both philanthropy often spends its money really well, but where does the money that philanthropy gets come from? And is the money that the philanthropy invests, is it in fossil fuel or not? Very difficult to find out because they are not obliged to tell us how they invest their money. But our initial knowledge shows us that they are investing in fossil fuels and in the fossil fuel economy. So there is a disconnect. And if you take if you take Amsterdam, Amsterdam makes a lot of money from the port of Amsterdam as well as from its shares in Schiphol, and both are very fossil fuel based. So even though Amsterdam spends its money quite nicely, its earning is not not. So there's an inconsistency, and we need to be really careful about that consistency. Then there are large companies and large governments that say my emissions are so large, I cannot do much without going bankrupt, losing GDP, losing votes. So, and also increasingly, we are seeing large AI companies saying, okay, we are no longer going to have a net zero or a near zero goal because they are going to use so much energy. But actually, the storyline should be for them that they have the critical mass for change. And if they can show leadership, they can massively change the entire narrative. And so they really need to focus on the opportunity side rather than the tragedy side. And of course, a lot of companies will also say, why should I take action? Others are not. And this is a common storyline I hear from individuals, from companies, from countries. And I think it's really important in all of this to take scope 3 seriously. So, scope 3 is the emissions of the entire value chain of products that come to you, and after you used it, and it goes through the process into the disposal or circular economy. How can the emissions associated with that be associated with your consumption process? Because if you do not take that into account, then you basically ignore most of the emissions, especially banks. For example, most of their emissions are scope 3 emissions, not scope 1 or scope 2, which are their direct and their energy emissions. So it's really important that we take the entire picture into account. This does lead to double and triple and quadruple counting, but it would massively focus us towards solving the problems. Now, who is emitting? All of us are emitting greenhouse gases when we use fossil fuel in our production and consumption process. So the fuel in your vehicles, the fuel in your house, all that is probably coming from fossil fuel. So that's important. But do not forget that the investors who have perhaps half the world's GDP in their balance sheet, pension funds, philanthropies, development banks, they are investing quite significantly in fossil fuel as well as in fossil fuel using production and distribution processes. And it's really important that they actually stop doing this and they aim at focusing at phasing out stranded assets and resources. And many of us are not just consumers, we're also have pension funds or we have savings. So we are also party to this process, and we need to become a movement in this process against this. I think fossil fuel companies cannot reinvent themselves. Most of them will probably collapse because of the fact that most of their wealth is in the oil, coal, and gas. Some can repurpose some of their infrastructure and reuse some of their employees to do other things, but they are on notice. If they do not change fast, there's a problem. For fossil fuel using companies, they should go for scope 1 to 3 is zero emissions, not net zero. They should try to make sure that they use their policies and their profits and send it downstream, send it back to the producers so that producers also can become fossil free. And I'm told you before, market mechanisms are not enough. We have to educate the public, and we all have a role in this. And of course, universities need to also integrate environmental and social justice into all faculties. Now, does this mean, I mean, there is a lot of bad news in this storyline, but I think that we have to get mobilized. And I think the first thing you need to do is to be conscious of your own consumption patterns. How much fossil fuel are you using on your daily basis, in the different activities that you do? How much meat do you consume directly and indirectly? And how can we change these patterns? And of course, your individual behavior matters less than if you can become an agent of change. So, but you need to be conscious of this because that can help you change the way you behave. So be conscious of your waste patterns. What are you throwing away? Where do you think it's going to land up? Because it is going to land up in the oceans eventually. And straws, do we want straws? Those are simple things, but let's see what we can reduce and then try to behave accordingly. But more importantly, that this is to become an agent of change, to mobilize your friends, to mobilize social media, to write letters to politicians, to join social movements. Because if we do not collectively protest against what is happening in the world today, we will not be able to compete with the fossil fuel companies and with other people and companies that are using social media to sell misinformation and disinformation. The World Economic Forum calls misinformation and disinformation the number one cause of environmental problems worldwide and the biggest security risk. Now, basically what I've been saying to you is we should not use our fossil fuels. So that means over time we have to get it to zero. Also, land and fresh water is actually decreasing in quality and therefore in quantity, whereas the demand is going up, the biosphere is decreasing in availability, and metals and minerals are decreasing. So basically, what we are seeing is a shrinking eco space. Now, when there is a shrinking space, what happens is a neoliberal capitalist will say, using the rational actor model, price it. And so then only the rich people can buy it. It'll be all marketed. And you are also seeing that with now with the reduction in aid money and with government money, the private sector is stepping in and buying off all these resources. And it's all protected through confidential contracts and investment agreements. And basically, this is not going to solve the problem because people who are outside the system will nevertheless pollute the system, and they are also affected by the system. The second option is hegemonic power. When a country says, my country first, you know who I'm talking about. There are many countries today that are just focusing on themselves and trying to break down the multilateral system and focusing on sovereignty and securitization of resources. This is also historically, this has been very prominent in the water fields, but today we are seeing this also in the energy and the economic fields. This is also very problematic because we share one earth and one environmental geopolitical system. The polycentric approach that Elena Ostrom was promoting is a very important system. It calls for self-management and experimentation, and I think it's very useful. But because the boundaries are so tight right now, I think we need to have a much better system of how to share these. And so we have to move away from a cost-benefit approach to a social practice model, which is based on transformative justice and maybe moves towards a global constitutional approach with goals, principles, and rules. And of course, this can be plural in idea. I have also got, in addition to my other projects, a global constitution project, which looks at law, technology, and socio-environmental and financial issues. But I'm inviting all of you to join this process through an essay, but we can also at some point think about doing a session on this. And all your essays will be taken on board. So if you send us a 1,000-word essay in any of your languages, you can send it to globalconstitution.org, and then you become a contributing author to the Global Constitution, which is a bottom-up storyline, as well as you get a certificate of participation. And I hope you will join. And I hope this also makes you feel more empowered in trying to change the world you want to live in. With that, I'm going to stop and thank you all. I've just been talking about three things: that there are scarce resources and sinks, and this requires sharing if we want to have a continuous flow of these resources for human life. Climate change has reached a crisis, and unless we all join together and demand change, it will not happen. And eventually, we all need a global constitution to re examine our relationship with each other and nature. Thank you.
Dear Joyeeta, thank you very, very much for this great and clear presentation that we had had today. And we have clear two things. No? We must be agent of change, and we had to send the word a word essay to be part of that global constitution. I don't see any question yet, and I think that everybody is absorbing all the facts and figures that you are sent. And but please, does somebody would like to have a question, a comment? Please write it in the chat.
We already
Everybody,
have one question from, I think we have it from Martin.
Martin, maybe he sent it in private to you. I cannot see it.
Yeah, it's in the.
Yes.
Shall I read it out, or will
Yes,
you read it
please.
out? So Martin Siebel has asked the question, considering the more and more right-leaning tendencies in the world, what type of political model is most useful to start to honestly work on bending down the many graphs showing the deteriorating Earth conditions? So I think that precisely because there is a movement right now to the right, and it's not just happening in developing countries, it's happening across Europe. It's also happening in many rich countries. So precisely at this moment, we need to have the counter movement. Why is this right-leaning tendency happening? In my view, it is because many people are aware first that the resources are decreasing, and there are people are fighting to get control over these resources. And also you're finding that investors don't know where to invest because a lot of investments are going into polluting substances. So non-polluting substances is by buying land and houses and water, but then most of that is land and water grabbing in the global south or other countries, which we also don't want. So my feeling is precisely because many of these right-wing politicians are fueled by not just this fear of the shrinking space, but also because of the misinformation and malinformation that is going out and making people vote against environmental issues. We need to create amongst us a social movement to balance that. That is why I said we need to become agents of change, and we have numbers on our side because the farmers are with us, the small farmers, not the big farmers. The social movements are with us. So we need to try and create this movement to try to bring these ideas. But I also think that, for example, politicians are there for 4 years as prime minister, and then they want to be re-elected, so they're all thinking short term. And the Fortune 500 companies, the CEOs are also there for only 3.5 years, so they don't care about the company's future either. And I think it's really important for us to try and make sure that all these politicians take a longer term view, and also the CEO. So even if you leave the company, it doesn't mean that your liability has ended for the decisions you made while you were there. So these are some of the ideas we are thinking about. We don't know whether they'll work, but we do have to change the way democratic systems function, because if they don't take the long term into account, we will always fail.
Thank you, Joyeeta. There is a question from France. I don't know if you want to read it or you want me to read it. I
You
don't know
can
if
read
you
it.
see it. I live in France, and CSR and HSE is a huge subject here, and companies are making effort to step up their business by focusing on this area. Do you think this is a net approach or a zero approach?
Neither. So what? No, I don't know about France in particular, but I see that the corporate social responsibility and some of these approaches by these companies does not necessarily mean that they actually reduce their emissions. So I heard, for example, in India, that these companies are then providing resources for some social activity, feeding people or whatever. But then that does not mean your own fossil fuels are going down. So unless they adopt a near zero approach, which means I'm trying to get to zero, but I can't fully, that won't work. And a net zero or a zero approach really requires policies to phase out fossil fuel. And in a net approach, there's a problem, because then you say, I keep increasing, but okay, I'm growing some trees in Ghana or Kenya or wherever, and therefore it compensates. That is a problem, because we see in the planting area a lot of fraud taking place.
Thank you. Here, Nanak from India, well, he says that it's a very insightful presentation. One suggestion: can we sensitize
The human rights
human rights
commissions.
commissions of the countries?
I think so. And in fact, I could suggest to you that you should download the judgment of the human rights court case that just took place in Latin America, because there the courts have come up and said very strongly that climate change is an emergency status, and it violates the human rights of people in many different ways, and it comes up with a very strong story. So distributing that a judgment to judges in developing countries and to national human rights commissions is really, really important. Also, don't forget that the International Court of Justice in The Hague has also come out with an advisory opinion where it says that every country is responsible for reducing its emissions because they should not cause harm to others, and that all countries should make stronger and stronger policies to make sure that these policies add up to 1.5 degrees centigrade, and that is not happening today. And the court does not say that you can go in excess. It does not say that. So there's a lot of information over here.
If you can share those links with me, Joyeeta, I will really appreciate it, so I can include it in the information I will send to all participants with the video.
Perfect.
Nanak will connect with the human rights in India. Thank you very much. Some more questions, some more comments for your side, Joyeeta.
No, I'm curious as to whether people, I mean, the point I'm trying to make right now is that Each one of us, whether we are scientists or we are NGO activists or we are housewives or we are investors, we have to go outside our own bubble to be part of this movement, because otherwise we are going to lose this battle. And if you pass 1.5 degrees, which is the way it's currently going, then the entire environment changes. So just because there are some Indians over here, if the entire Himalayan belt starts to melt, then your rivers will become, from perennial rivers, they will become seasonal rivers. How are you going to meet the water needs of the entire area that starts, I think, from Afghanistan all the way till Mekong area? All of them come from the Himalayan belt. How will you meet the water needs if you cannot recharge the water? So climate change has a very big impact on your water systems. And don't forget, the heat will be unbearable in most of your countries. And you will not be able, the farmers will not be able to work during the daytime. It will be so it's really important that we all mobilize each other and not just think, what can I do in my own life, but what can I do to change at least 10, 15 people around me?
Well, make sure that I will distribute this video very, very much in our community. And I hope all the ones that are here also take the same action to put a little bit, a seed of effort from our side. Eric van der Lee thanks Professor Gupta and a wonderful presentation. My question is, how does the global constitution aim to balance universal obligations oh, with national sovereignty, giving inequality capacities, political will, and enforcement mechanisms across the states?
So currently, the last nearest attempt to a global constitution is the 1945 Charter of the UN. It's, I'm hoping that by 2045, the world will be at a mood to create a global constitution. Now, what we are trying to do is we're trying to create this bottom-up movement and legitimacy by collecting ideas from people worldwide in their own languages. We can now use AI to translate some of these, but we will try to minimize the use of AI because of its energy impact. But what we want to do is to take all these ideas together to create this idea of a global constitution. So it will be a bottom-up document, and it will be like a code. A code prepared by the people, and all of you are authors. So if you all submit, we are hoping to have at least 500 co-authors, contributing authors, and maybe even more, maybe 10,000 contributing authors. We don't know. It depends on how many people actually write essays. And do not make the perfect enemy of the good. Just submit your ideas, because that's most important. And then the thing is that if you can mobilize enough action from bottom, there may be a day that we get a phone call saying, hey, does anybody have any ideas or what should be in a global constitution, and we should have this ready. I'll give you a little example. A few years ago, when COVID was happening, I remember I mobilized a group of colleagues, and we wrote a letter to the minister saying we do not agree with her COVID policy, and we gave her reasons for that. And then she phoned me, and her first question was, what do you want me to do? And I thought, I'm so stupid. I know what you should not do. I don't know what you should do. So right now, I think there might be a moment that people suddenly say, hey, what do you want in this constitution? And then we have a document ready. And anyway, in my current position as co-chair of the Science, Technology, and Innovation of the UN, I can put some ideas already in about this global constitution. So we do have a back door, at least, to this. And of course, the idea would be that we would try to create a plural but universal constitution. So it would allow for differences. And the question about political will that you raise, I mean, the court says very clearly that you cannot cause damage to other countries and other people. And so I think this is also a question of liability across countries. So we need to think about that.
Thank you very much. Tatiana dos Santos Silva from Brazil ask, how would it make sense to work with the small micro companies and entrepreneurs on this climate change perspective regarding how they manage their business? I work with this audience in Brazilian favelas. 70% of active companies in Brazil are small ones.
Thank you for this question. I think this is very important. So it depends a little bit on how small they are. But I personally feel that really small companies between 1 and 10 people, for example, or households, maybe we should not be harassing them to think about what kind of energy they themselves use. But can we organize a cooperative that organizes the solar panels or wind energy so that when they switch on their electricity, they are getting renewable energy or other kinds of energy? So the question over here is, how can we mobilize the NGOs or cooperatives to try to take this responsibility, and even municipalities take these responsibilities away from these tiny companies? When we are talking about a company that is about 250, because in Europe up to 250 people is SME. When we're talking about bigger companies, then I think of course they should focus on trying to see if they themselves can mobilize change in their energy production process and also in their waste management. But I mean, in Brazil, let's get the billionaires to function and provide resources. This is true for India as well. The billionaires have so much money, and so let's see if we can mobilize them to finance some of these activities. You cannot make the poorest take the largest responsibility.
Thank you, Joyeeta. I will ask you permission for a 5 minutes extra if you can, because now people are getting enthusiastic with the question. Edmond asks, well, a lot of the reality we face is admitted disinspiriting. What stories are there that we can use to inspire and energize others as agents of change, especially the youth who will be able to live through the consequences of our collective action?
So you're right. There's a lot of bad news that is coming up. But on the other hand, if I look at the Secretary General of the UN, he is fighting so much on social justice and environmental justice issues. But it is difficult for him to function alone. He needs to know that the youth of the world support him in his perspective. I look at the World Economic Forum. There we have the First Movers Coalition. There is a bunch of big companies that are trying to push the environmental agenda forward. So you're seeing activities happening in different places. You see also youth activists are moving, they are leading this process, they are calling for change. So, the thing is, we need to find a way in which the latest scientific information is translated by youth to change the world. And youth have to take action over this. Youth can also work with the elderly, with senior citizens, because senior citizens maybe also have the time to think about this. And many of the senior citizens in the rich countries, at least, have had a major responsibility in causing the problem. But senior citizens also have more time. So can we make a coalition between the youth and senior citizens to mobilize action?
Altogether, Nanak just mentioned that climate resilience was needs to be published from push from United Nations to safeguard our valuable resources. And
Yeah, so
see,
there's a problem over here because when we are talking about the United Nations, right now the United Nations is under attack, as you might know. Some very large countries are not paying their dues, and this is causing a major financial crisis in the UN. And I think if the UN collapses, we have a problem because we need a multilateral approach to address global issues. So I think part of this whole storyline is how can we support the UN, at least through our letters. We don't finance it, but through our movement, that the UN should be strong. But of course, climate resilient WASH is absolutely essential. And my gut feeling is that at this moment, that is not the case. But the problem, of course, with the UN is if it is under so much pressure, if the WHO is under pressure because it doesn't get resources, then we need to join hands. All of us need to join hands with the scientists, with the UN bodies to see if we can push the narrative further.
Asif Iqbal asks how we can hold large companies accountable for actively motivating and enabling their employee to engage in pro-environmental behavior.
So I think there are two challenges over here. The first is when you're closing down a coal mine or an oil and gas company, then you need to find alternative jobs for your personnel, and that's called the just transition. And the International Labour Organization has done quite a bit of work on that. But basically, if we are closing it down, we have to find alternative jobs. In other types of companies, I think it's really important for senior leadership to set the tone. Senior leadership has to educate the employees. Senior leadership has to show how it can be done. And senior leadership has to demand it from the employees if they, for example, that pro-environmental behavior may lead to a bonus in your income or some other kind of reward. But this is really important. But there are different storylines here depending on whether you're closing down a polluting company or you are reducing pollution from a less polluting company.
And we are going to go to the last questions, two last questions. Thank you very much. Of course, comes in all the questions. And Mila Camille says, I wonder to what extent can the United Nations FCCC transparency framework serve as a mechanism to promote climate justice? Specifically, could it be expanded to require parties, cities, and business to report not only on their mitigation efforts, but also on the environmental degradation and ecological harm for which they are responsible?
So Neela, my answer to your question is that I personally feel that we have to go outside the UNFCCC for the movement to put pressure on the governments. A transparency framework will get bureaucratized, but if you add more responsibilities on states, they will not do it. What's more important is to not only report on their mitigation efforts, but has it really been effective? Did they take the action? Did they actually reduce their emissions, or is their emissions going up in somewhere else? And the big problem over the transparency framework is that maybe in the long term it has some role to play, but we need to try not to miss the 1.5-degree target. That's 4 years. That basically means we have to mobilize now to get action taken by our governments in different parts of the world, whether it is in the developing world or in the global north. All countries have to get to zero. It's not like, it be the rich countries have to take action first. There is no time. And if we keep saying it's the other person who's responsible, nothing will happen. So it's very important that you try to put pressure on each country to try to get to zero ASAP. And of course, transparency can be demanded by the NGOs.
And Sarvas Omer says how we can mitigate the climate change impacts on our planet and the world plan by developing countries, Gaza, Ukraine, etc., and ban natural resources management among countries, for example, Turkey and Iraq. They are not giving enough water to Iraq. It may increase desertification and destroy marshlands.
So let's just take the first part. The first part is a bigger problem than
Yeah.
Gaza and Ukraine right now. Those two are really terrifically horrible problems. But more than that, what we are seeing is that the investments in weapons is going up a lot. Under the climate convention, you're not obliged to tell how much you're investing in weapons and therefore what the greenhouse gas emissions of these weapons industry and the defense industry is. So this is going to be significant. Some of our data, I think, is quite frightening in terms of how the greenhouse gas emissions are going up from just the defense mechanism, but also from the war. And of course, war has horrific impacts on the lives of people. My gut feeling on all these issues is that we have to become citizens. We cannot just be consumers. This is not my own language. I've heard this somewhere else. A lot of the time, people are consumers, they just consume. But citizenship means that you get out on the street and you make your voice known. You try to communicate with others about these kinds of issues and you try to create power through the masses. And whether, and your example about Turkey and Iraq, this is just one example of all the different water challenges that we have in all the transboundary river basins across the world. To mobilize action, we just have to mobilize citizenship. Citizenship is not just a right, it's a responsibility. And all of us in democracies have to take it.
Last question, because we continue till 5. Winnie, for low and middle income countries like Uganda, what can we do about having so many old vehicles on roads that emit a lot of carbon into the atmosphere?
Winnie, generally speaking, vehicles don't have a very long lifetime. And so the next vehicle that comes in has to be a clean vehicle. Of course, I know in India, they used to keep vehicles for 40, 50 years by continuously repairing them. This is a really big problem. For me, actually, the role of the e-vehicle is very important in terms of public transport. I think all governments have to invest in public and shared transport. So don't forget that most vehicles are parked for 95% of the day, private vehicles. So in fact, with less vehicles, we can transport the same number of people the same number of kilometers. But on the one hand, we have to reduce the number of kilometers, we have to do public transport, and we have to do shared transport. And hopefully, the next generation of vehicles will be renewable.
Well, I had to finish with Martin Siebel. I cannot say no to him, but you complicate my life, Martin. In Dutch, he said, is a spreekwoord, a saying that says, als het kalf verdronken is damned man de put. I cannot translate it. Is the global community willing or able to avoid the point indicated by the spreekwoord?
I don't know, Martin, but what really frightens me is that when I look at people who are working on scenarios, they are not doing backcasting. I think they should be doing backcasting. How do we get to 1.5? Instead, they are doing forecasting and they're saying, oh, the global world is going like this. We have all these demands. Therefore, we will inevitably cross this. And that worries me because that's the scientific community that is also doing that. And I personally feel that there is a moment now. It is like a COVID moment in some ways. There is an emergency. The court calls it an emergency, and we need to all sit together and see, can we avoid the calf from drowning? And not solve the problem after it. And in any case, we cannot solve the problem once the tipping points go, because once the tipping points are triggered, we have no idea what the environment will do. We have no idea how we are going to do agriculture in the ways we did it before, and our entire hydrological cycle becomes completely unreliable. So it is really frightening, and that is one of the reasons I'm speaking to all of you. We have to mobilize now.
Well, thank you very much, Joyeeta. And for this fantastic presentation, I would like to inform all the participants that I also thank for being here with us, that we will have the next seminar in November. But I would like to give the floor to Joyeeta with 3 words to close this seminar, and of course to invite everybody to share the video of this event that we are going to share in the coming days. Joyeeta, you close,
Thank you.
please.
Get up and mobilize.
Thank you very,
Thank you.
very much. See you, and thank you very much, Joyeeta.
Thank you.